Greetings, everybody. Nick here, and welcome back to the podcast. So, you want to be a musician. We're at episode number 8, and the guest for this episode is Mr. Steve Hackett. Now, I'm down here in Portsmouth, UK, the south of the UK, rehearsing with my band, Big Train, for our upcoming tour, The Likes of Us 2024. And we're at this great rehearsal studio called Casemates down here in Portsmouth. If you're in a band, you live anywhere in this area, need a place to rehearse, I recommend this place highly. It's very cool. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm filming this introduction for you, and in the room next to me is a woman practicing some opera. So if you hear any strange noises in the background, she sounds great, but if you're wondering what that sound is, there's a woman practicing opera. It's a rehearsal place, and she's practicing, and you know, that's what you do at a rehearsal place, right? All right, so back to the introduction of this podcast. I'm really excited to bring you this episode because talking with Steve is very special for me in a number of ways. You know, when I was growing up as a kid, Genesis was by far my favorite band. Phil Collins was my favorite drummer. There was just a huge influence on me, that band. And the music, I learned a lot about being a musician from listening to that music over and over and over again as a kid. It just taught me so much. And then I went through my life and my career and played in Spock's Beard and was in that whole progressive rock world, joined Big Train, all of those kinds of things. And I met Steve at a Progressive Rock Awards in the UK up in London. And from that point forward, we kept in touch. I was really excited to meet him, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And then he asked me to record on one of his songs. He knew of me as a drummer, which I had no idea. He knew who I was. And from recording on one of the earlier records, he asked me to record again. And again, I've played on a number of Steve Hackett records now, which blows my mind. And then a couple of years ago, the amazing drummer Craig Blundell, who's been playing with Steve and in his band for a number of years, asked if I would sub for him for a few gigs in Canada and in North America. Well, I mean, I jumped at the chance because Steve's band is amazing. And to play those songs with Steve was like, what a highlight of my career. So I'm just super thankful that I got to know Steve, to record on some of his records, to play live with him, and hanging out with Steve and getting to know him a little bit. I realized that he's just a really cool guy, super nice, very knowledgeable. He's had a long and storied career. He's got tons of great stories, and he's a really good hang. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, thank you so much. Subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on Podbean, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, follow the podcasts. And without further ado, my conversation with Mr. Steve Hackett. Welcome, everybody. Nick DiVirgilio here, and this is the podcast, So You Want to Be a Musician. And my guest today is Mr. Steve Hackett. Steve, thank you so much.
Nice to be talking again. How are you doing?
I still find it such a trip that we have become acquaintances over the years, and we make music together, and I've been on your records, and I've got to play with you live a little bit, and it's just been those have been such great moments in my life. I really appreciate you having me along for those things.
Well, likewise, you know, I'm always thrilled at the stuff that you've done on the records that we've made. It's always, at the very least, brilliant, and try and think of another superlative to.
No, that's a pretty high bar. That's good.
Yeah, no, very, very musical, especially on the latest album, on the track called "People of the Smoke," the track that kicks off the album. The lovely thing is that there were times when it sort of rocks out, and then other times when it's kind of almost orchestral, and you sort of sat out and allowed things to build, not necessarily to power through with rhythm, but I think that ability or that instinct of when not to play is a very important one, because I think that, you know, a lot of the time we musicians want to prove ourselves and show our chops and hey, look, Mum, I can do this. But there is the other side of things, when not to do things and not to get in the way and clutter things. You know, sometimes it's better to be tacit, in other words, silent, and that's silence. Maybe that's the last thing that we have to really learn. You know, it's. You know, I think you acquire more and more technique, and people say that that young musicians start off with passion and end up with technique. Of course, you know, that's a cynical view. It's true, that, of course, because I can play so much faster now than when I was starting off as a young kid, I have to remember to slow myself down and go, well, actually, you've got to remember the adage that people have or have said about prog music. Why does it only attract guys? It's like, the more notes, the less women. I remember Julian Colbeck saying this. So this might be an insult to women in the audience for this at
Right.
this point, but there is something to be said that progressive stuff tends to attract a male crowd.
Yeah.
But hey, to have an audience of anything, we used to have audiences of captive kids at private schools that we used to play with Genesis in the early days. They went absolutely nuts. Single sex shows, absolutely nuts for it, because they were literally a captive audience. It wasn't what we were doing to them, it was what ever else was going on around them. But
wow. Yeah.
hey,
well, listen, hey, rests are part of the musical, the musical score. When you see notes going across the page and there's a whole note rest, you're not supposed to play there.
That's right. Yes. Well, you must have orchestral experience, because very often you'll be watching the poor guy on the triangle in the whatever symphony orchestra it
Right.
is, and he gets he's lucky if he gets to play one little tinkle every 100 bars.
Right.
So yeah, of course.
Okay.
But that's the essence of it, through composition, of course.
Of course.
And maybe young listeners or watchers would say, no, hey, no, I'm going to be a hero and I'm going to play over everything, and then you're really going to upset the singer and everybody else. So yeah.
Well, that's a great way to start this whole thing, but I'm going to take a step back and start with the question. Well, we already started, but the main question I start with all the artists first, and it's sort of a heavy one, and we sort of kind of lighten up as we go, but I think it's a good way to start these podcasts off, is this. Do you, Steve Hackett, need to play music to be happy?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, okay. Yes. Yeah, I mean, the long answer to that, and stop me if I say too much, is that the one thing that can't be taught is the love of it. You either love it to bits or you don't. And I know that you do, or else you wouldn't do what you do. And I do, because that's why I do it. Even if there was no audience and we were selling no records or no tickets, there's the Van Gogh effect, which is, at the end of the day, would you still paint even if you never sold a painting in your life except to your brother? And the truth is, the man would still paint. And yesterday's disaster, of course, today's triumph, and all the rest.
That's a great answer. So do you find that you still have the same sort of passion for music as you did when you were a young man in the 70s, and kind of grown up and wanting to be a musician? As a man that's made lots of records and had a long career, do you still have that same fervor for it all?
I do. I think that when I was young, guitar playing in particular seemed as if it was such a symbol of freedom. Whatever else was taught at school, nobody was going to fail you on guitar, my chosen instrument, and I suspect for you on drums. Okay, I didn't have a teacher for guitar, which meant that everybody that I watched who was doing anything remotely interesting, each of those people became my teacher. So I am not, in the strict sense of the word, a self-taught person. I'm an observer. I've listened, I've watched. I just never really invested anybody with the title guru, saying, yeah, this is the correct way of doing it, this is the incorrect way. I much preferred to go my own route with all of that, and at times perhaps invent your own language so that no one can say you've got the grammar wrong here. So a little old thing I came up with, which later was named by Eddie Van Halen, was tapping, and it was a technique that enabled you to use the fretboard like a keyboard. All the notes were open on that fretboard because you weren't constrained to having to play a note with a plectrum and having the corresponding note ready in order to have it in position on the fretboard. I'm not explaining this very well, but
no, I get it.
The idea that you could hammer on and hammer off, it meant that all the fingers were free. They were all basically doing the same job. So you could nip around and you could be the fastest gun in the West. It was a way of playing fast. It was much more than a one-horse trick, and it's become part of the glossary of terms for shredders, heavy metal people, all the rest. It's a great way of working. It's a technique. There are many others, as I'm sure you've developed yourself.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were a young man and you knew you wanted music to be your career, I imagine you got to a point where you said, this is the way I want to go. What were some things you were doing as a young man in London in the late 60s, that kind of time, to get yourself noticed? And do you think that kids or younger players in this day and age, is it sort of the same, a similar sort of thing?
Well, if I can cut to the chase, I think you need to form bonds with like-minded people. You have to, you've got to work with others, unless you're an absolute genius and able to entertain people with your chosen instrument and none other.
Right.
Beyond that, you've got to form these bonds. You've got to leave no stone unturned. It's no good being a legend in your own bedroom. You do have to get out there. I know many people. I've got many guys of a certain age who are friends of mine who've had fabulous careers doing one thing, and then they decide to be writers, for instance. And then I say to them, have you engaged with the publisher so far? And they say, oh, no, I'm just doing this for my own benefit. Frustratingly, I hear this. And I think for music, you have to get used to communicating with people, communicating with the team that's putting it across in order to engage with a wider team of people called the audience. So that's this symbiotic relationship. We need each other. It can't exist in splendid isolation. Would that it could, but it's somewhat different from the painter's art, where the painter, like my father, locks himself away for hours, weeks, days, years, produces perfect canvases, and then takes them out. It's not like that. It's almost as if music is conversation. It's another kind of language that speaks directly to the emotions, and it's got the drama has just got to be played out in front of people. So when I was growing up, I decided at 16 that I left school with not many qualifications, just enough to scrape by. And I started doing jobs pretty much like my father suggested. But I always knew at the back of my mind, the dream was there if I could make music professionally. So by the time I was 21 or even 20, that was starting to become a reality for me. In those days, back in the olden days, the olden days of 1970, way before most people who are watching this were probably born, we had a music paper, a rag called Melody Maker, and that was all important. All would-be musicians got hold of that weekly paper every time. You couldn't wait for it to come out. And the want ads in the back, people would advertise themselves, and I became a fervent self-advertiser. I would advertise myself every single week if I had the money, because you had to pay money. Each word cost you a certain amount. Now,
Okay.
I realize this sounds like very old technology. We're talking about paper, ink,
Right.
people going out, buying something that they read and scoured it from top to bottom, front to back. But many English bands were formed off of the back pages of that. And probably all the big bands that have survived from the 60s, 70s, and into the ones that are still alive, still doing it.
Right.
Of course. So Genesis was no stranger to that, as were Led Zeppelin no stranger to that. I remember John Paul Jones playing bass with Zeppelin, who'd worked with Jimmy Page a little bit at one point. And he said to me when we were working in Japan, he said, it was my wife who said, it just read in the paper that Jimmy Page is looking for a bass player for a band. And he said, oh, he's probably already got a bass player. But his wife said, well, why don't you give him a call anyway? Worlds turn on such events. Someone says that. So, it's the Woody Allen syndrome or the idea of, is it 80%, 90% of success is just showing up, making the call, booking the whatever it is.
Yeah.
And getting out there and not being shy. I'm a very shy person, you wouldn't believe. But I've learned to rein in my shyness because it's not really going to get you anywhere. So in a room full of people who want to hear the apparent wisdom that you possess, I've had to get over the fact that whenever I get up to the mic, I think I'm boring them rigid. No one wants to hear what I've got to say, and I've got to deal with that internal invalidator. I think the British suffer a lot from this. A lot of introverted British people who don't have the confidence that I suspect that our American cousins do have. It's probably to do with the educational system that, when we were all growing up, we were all told by our teachers that we were completely useless. And we were the scum of the earth. There was no encouragement, very little of that.
Trying to make you stronger by that kind of,
I guess so, or just bloody mindedness.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what motivated so many of them, but I think it was very different from the can-do
right
aspect of America, and I think Britain has suffered from that a lot. Many talented people I've known who've not gotten, more talented than me, who've not gotten as far or had the longevity of the career that I have, just because I was perhaps stupid enough to go, well, I don't think I'll really be good at anything else. I could just about, when I worked for firms in offices, they'd employ me as a runner to go and post a letter somewhere else right across London, and I think, oh, good, I'm out of the office, that's fine. Or at one point, I was banging nails into the road, working for a surveyor, doing the unskilled part of the team. You didn't need to go to college for that, but round about that time that I was banging nails into the soft tarmac because it was a very hot summer, and I thought, this is the doddle, I'm out in the open. My responsibility begins and ends with each nail. But a guy came up to me who was a singer that I knew, and he said, come to the Marquee on Sunday. I promise you won't be disappointed. It's a band called King Crimson. So I did, and he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
Before they made In the Court the Crimson King, there was this extraordinary band who were extraordinarily precise with a pan-genre approach, covering jazz, epics, from classical to pop to jokes to so many things. It was very, very broad-based, and I thought, this is a template for the type of band that I one day hope to be making a living with. And that band, maybe a year or so later, happened to become Genesis for me.
That's amazing. What a great story. I love hearing those kinds of things, how you envision the dream, you still have in your head, even though you're doing odd jobs to survive, and somehow it takes place, and you sort of manifested that dream to come true.
And the other thing, you know, I'm talking about fortuitous moments. I mentioned the John Paul Jones advice from his wife, and I mentioned the singer. There's a singer called Mike Docker. I don't know where he is now. He said, "Oh, come and see King Crimson." There's one other instance, if I can remember that, where, for instance, I was sitting Saturday afternoon in a pub, a bar, should we say, in London's King's Road.
Yes.
Going absolutely nowhere. And a friend of mine who was a photographer said, "So what are you up to?" I said, "Oh, there's this band. You know, they want me to join them. They want to rehearse in the country, you know. I don't know about that, you know." And he said, "Well, you're not doing anything better right now, are you? You might as well join them." And of course, that band was Genesis. I was completely undecided, you know, because you have ideas in your mind of, you know, the idealistic approach. You think it's all going to be served to you on a plate. It isn't. You've got to carve it out. You have to make compromises. There are other people in that team who will have firm ideas that will not concur with yours. But if there's a drive within a team to do something really outstanding, I think there's a very good chance. I know it's tougher right now because, you know, people say, well, of course, you're competing with machines. You don't need musicians to make hit records. And indeed, in many cases, be right. You don't need musicians at all if it's artificial intelligence. You just program in something and something comes out that sounds remarkably human and accomplished. But I don't think it's all over for musicians, because what we do when we perform in front of someone and someone thinks it's absolutely miraculous that this can be done and can be done live, then people are still paying money.
Oh, yeah.
To go see the two of us.
To me, that's the drug of music. That's the immense joy that you get. The immediate response when you're on stage and you perform that song, and then you finish the song and the crowd claps and screams and yells. That is just, there's almost no better feeling. I think it's just amazing.
I know what you mean. Yes, yeah. I agree with you. When you've played a complete concert and it's gone well and the crowd have loved it, and even though you were tired beforehand, because you're always going to be tired being on stage, it's whether you're young or old, it will exhaust you. It'll take everything you've got. And the hardest thing for me is getting my stage stuff off, getting back into my normal clothes, putting away the Superman suit, and becoming Clark Kent again. I find my coordination completely goes. Oops, you know, can't get the pants off, you know, can't do that. Where's this? Where's that? Let alone get in a vehicle and drive away. I wouldn't subject anyone to that. It would be danger, you know, on the high road. Not a good idea. So I do sympathize, because I'm sure there are people who may be taking this in thinking, oh, it's impossible. But then, you know, when I was a kid, I don't know who your heroes were. You probably tell me. Think of a hero in the drumming field or the singing field. Is there anyone who engaged you and you just thought, I want to do something like this?
Well, I mean, your bandmate Phil Collins was my idol as a kid. I mean, I really looked up to you and the band quite a bit in my early days, and I learned how to play a lot from those records.
Well, they're very, you know, the drumming on it is very, very accomplished. Yeah. And even the live things, I can hear that he's playing to a higher level technically than the rest of us are. So for me, when I was growing up, you know, I'd be practicing along to Rolling Stones records, anything I could find in those early days, Beatles stuff, what have you. But then, of course, I heard Andres Segovia, these records that were made in the 1920s and the 1930s and have been transferred from medium to medium. I had no idea of what hi-fi was. In the mid-60s, hi-fi was not an issue. You were listening to performance on dodgy dance set, gramophones and what have you. But I thought, well, I doubt if I'll ever be able to play to this standard, but maybe I can take on board some of it. And I think taking on board some of it was the respect for detail. And I suspect it may have been the same for you. You're taking on board detail that you think initially, oh, I don't know if I can use that, but you start to incorporate it, and perhaps from one medium or one genre to inform another, which is why progressive stuff borrows from the jazzers who've done their lessons. It borrows from the classical people who've done their lessons and all the rest. And then it's, people like me who've never done their lessons, but want to listen to everything and take things, Gannett-like from, I'll take this from there, I'll be a sketch from there, and to be to have a committed hodgepodge of an approach. I think it's a very good way to go forward. I wish I knew more about harmony, but that'll have to be another lifetime, I suspect.
Well, the music you make, man, you definitely know some things about harmony for sure.
We try,
Yeah. However it works, you do it just right. That's good.
And do you know what I think that, there are some guys that I've worked with who I thought were absolutely phenomenal. And at times I've been amazed to hear them say, in their own words, that they suffer from imposter syndrome. Even some people who are really great, the imposter syndrome thing. I think even Jeff Beck suffered from that. I had a first conversation I had with him on a day when I was having a get-together with Eric Clapton, Steve Howe, David Gilmour, Hank Marvin. We were all there to celebrate Hank Marvin, who was relocating to Australia. But I was talking to Jeff Beck, and I thought, I can see he's uncomfortable, being in this situation where probably everyone else in the room is thinking, how marvelous is this guy? And he's thinking that if you listen to, certain or read certain interviews, he'll consider himself to be a bluff guitarist. I'm a bluff guitarist. He's bluffing. I don't know. Well, one man's bluff is another man's genius, of course. So that's. Yeah. But I think there's a certain amount of modesty that was endearing, shall we say, in there.
Yeah. And somehow, like yourself, he got through that stuff that was in his head and made some amazing music. Yeah. Had a very
amazing.
Long career.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I love all this information you're telling me here, Steve. This is great. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about dealing with other people, and the point where, like in Genesis, when you were about to leave after Wind and Wuthering.
Yeah.
How was it? How did you deal with it mentally leaving the band? I know it wasn't an easy time. You wanted to go and do your solo thing and have some more freedom in your music. Yes. But in your own head, how hard was that? And how did you kind of overcome those things to move forward?
Okay. Well, basically, that decision to leave took at least a year and a half, if not 2 years. I'd made an album on my own. I'd enjoyed the process a little bit too much to surrender it, at that time, it was really falling foul of band politics,
right,
to be doing solo albums. Ironically, Phil was doing something where he had a whole band on the side, which was, Brand X. And when we were recording at one point in Trident, he was making one album upstairs with Genesis and another album downstairs with Brand X. The ubiquitous Mr. Collins, as he was, full of energy in those days. For some reason, he didn't seem to come into any, there wasn't any flack. But I guess because I'd had my name on the top of this album that could have been presented as a band, it could have been Brand X, Brand Y, but it made it kind of difficult within the band. And I knew that I had to continue to do something that was considered to be undermining or subversive for the band, to have a parallel solo career. Peter Gabriel left for the same reason. He wanted to have a parallel solo career. That wasn't on offer from the band. Certainly wasn't something, I didn't stand in his way with that, but founder members, having made that decision, the euphoria lasted just about an afternoon. And then I thought, here's the harsh reality. You know, it's like, what happens now? There is no organization. You have to be the organization yourself. You will have to make every phone call. You will have to book everybody yourself. You don't have a manager. You don't have a road crew. You don't have this. You don't have that. All you've got is youthful bravado and optimism. So it was very difficult for me in the days when I was struggling to have hit records. Sometimes albums would do better than others. Luckily, I had a loyal following from people who liked the first thing I'd done and obviously liked Genesis. It was a great thing, a great jumping off point in a way, a great calling card. In those days, I wasn't playing any Genesis stuff live. I made up my mind in the first year to form a band and to go out and play stuff and play new stuff. And then it all gets a bit hazy. Of course, Genesis were going on, you know, they became MTV darlings. They were having hit after hit after hit. And this is before Phil started to take off, outselling the band by 4-1. You know, the singing drummer who was more famous than the band he was in. It was an extraordinary thing that, you know, and I remember at one point when, you know, Phil's star was in the ascendant to such a degree that I remember Peter Gabriel said to me, I can't go into a bathroom anywhere and take a leak without hearing Phil, you know. And I said, well, same thing happened to me. You know, I got diverted in the middle of a snowstorm trying to land in Lake Tahoe. First thing happens, I go to the bathroom, and what should be happening? You know, it'll be one of Phil's greatest hits, and right. Nobody was bigger than Phil at that point. You know, I think he had a level of success to make Elton John jealous at that point. So, like the song says from Yes, yours is no disgrace. You have to say to yourself, well, if I'm primarily an instrumentalist, it's unlikely that I'm going to rival Elvis or Roy Orbison here. Yes, perhaps singing can be acquired and can be part of what I do. And that was another conversation with Peter Gabriel where he said, well, yes, I think singing's possible. He said, if I can sing, anyone can, referring to himself. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he's right. It can be learned. It's a skill that can be acquired. It's not as reliable as playing an instrument. My tuning's never going to be as good as dong dong dong. Yeah, okay, but me. It's not quite. It's not indestructible tuning. And you know the terrible thing about thinking that you're singing wonderfully in tune in headphones, and then you hear it back and you hear that it's a quarter tone right. Flat. You know, so one can on, one can off.
All that
whatever
stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
Beatles used to have this thing called the elephant or the white elephant, which was a speaker that would play stuff back to them, and they would sing along to it. I mean, how that was possible, I do not know, but at least they weren't dealing with, you know, the that terrible block, the mental block that is there with headphones. I don't know, because I started singing after Genesis. But how about you? Were you singing from the word go? Were you
I started singing
singing.
before I played drums. Actually, I was
There you go. You see,
very, very young. So it's been with me since I was a young kid. Johnny Osmond was the guy I looked up to when I was 4 or 5 years old.
There you go. Of course. And Phil Collins, which we've both mentioned here, Phil was singing on stage in Oliver, the musical,
Right.
playing the part of the Artful Dodger, long before he was beating the Skins professionally. So Phil was already a veteran of stage school, and he was an extremely experienced performer. And one thing he said to me that when I had said, how nervous I was on stage in the early days, he said, you should learn to enjoy your work more. And it was a very, very good lesson. In other words, when you're doing it, smile, even if you think you're going to make a terrible boo-boo in the next bar. I think if people realize that you're enjoying yourself, they will enjoy themselves as well, because you let them off the hook, and it's no longer about the detail, it's about something else is going on. There's another level of energy, it's another dimension, actually enjoying yourself when you're doing it.
Well, it is music. Music is supposed to make you,
Indeed.
it's supposed to be about enjoyment. Even if it's a sad song, there's still some pleasure out of it all. And
no, you're supposed to grit your teeth and suffer through it.
Yes. So what I gather here is you've been pretty strong-willed, and you focused on your dream. I mean, you even kind of struggling through some hard times, you still saw where you wanted to go, and you kind of paved the way and just sort of made it happen.
Yeah. Well, I also decided at one point that, having sweated blood to make the Genesis stuff happen and work, I made the decision at one point to rekindle interest in an era of Genesis that was perhaps pre-MTV approval, but was an era of Genesis that drew the attention of John Lennon, who liked, let's call it, the early stuff, the 70s stuff. And that was a real shot in the arm, knowing, or having heard round about the time of when we were first touring America, selling England by the pound, that he thought that we were, he said at one point, true sons of the Beatles. So that's the best review I've ever had. So that, though, in a way, if I needed any more sanction to go out and do these antiquated, difficult, detailed, but lovely songs, there it is, right then and there. That's it. So he got it, and we got the Beatles, and I think to some degree, a Beatle or the Beatles got us, and that's important. So if you can, if you say that there's something going on here, that the candle's being, or perhaps it's like the baton, it's being passed, back and forth. And of course, I look back to pre-Beatles. I'm not just interested in modern music, but I'm interested in old stuff, medieval stuff. I want to know about music that kicked off from the Greeks. That's how I want to hear what they could do as well, to inform myself. Was there, what was around? Yeah. Was it jazz? Was it spontaneous? Was it folk music? Would have certainly been that. What is folk music? Some will say that folk music and jazz is folk music. Others would say perhaps, it's a much more schooled thing. But I think it doesn't really matter what the genre is. I think it's, if that fires you up, then wonderful. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. There will be those who will invalidate you. Don't become an internal invalidator. Don't criticize yourself. Don't become your own worst enemy. You can be a constructive critic, but give yourself a pat on the back for God's sake, or else you'll never be a professional.
That's amazing. Now, did you realize those things later on in life? Were you able to tell yourself that when you were in your mid to early, in 20s and fighting through these things?
I don't think I could articulate a lot of the things. I might have had an instinct on this stuff, but I've learned to be able to express myself because I've been used to speaking about myself. It's not something that I could do. I was mute for how many years? For 30 years. And then I started to speak because I had to. I had to justify myself. I had to sell myself. We
got to do sometimes. Yeah.
Well, that's it. You see, that's it. And engaging with other people, and if you're not a very good conversationalist, there's a very good lesson. Somebody said, well, ask them about themselves. I've noticed that there are people who are comfortable about talking about themselves, but they're not necessarily comfortable at talking. And some of the people in Genesis could be remarkably tight-lipped, and because of their background, I suspect, and almost a sort of wartime mentality of careless talk costs lives, or I don't know what it is, but it can be the stiff British upper lip thing, and only speaking when it's absolutely necessary, or when you've had a few drinks. That can be telling. But for instance, I bumped into Tony Banks the other day on the street. We had a 15-minute conversation.
Nice.
At one point, it would have been 15 seconds. How are you? Yeah, okay, all right, see you. But no, it was interesting because I think there's mutual respect, but I think that had to be earned over time. It's actually very nice whenever I see the guys now and we have a chat. It means a lot to me because I do hold them in considerable affection, and perhaps people don't realize that. Musicians can be very competitive.
Sure.
But it's never worth. I'll get to the right word. It's never worth being acrimonious about people that you've once worked with. There's no point. It's better just to say, yeah, their strengths were A, B, C, D. I happen to have been in something that I regarded to be a great band with no passengers, and they've earned their place, really.
Sure. Well, life takes us through so many twists and turns. I mean, if it didn't go down the direction it went back in those days, it may not have led you to where you are today.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
I mean, you're here for. I mean, I believe things happen for a reason. So you're probably where you are on purpose. It's supposed to be that way.
Well, I think so. I mean, we're talking about bands because we are basically, children of rock and roll, you and me. That's really it. But if you'd gone the route of the conservatory and being trained to be a classical composer, the idea that yes, you are the drummer, you are the singer, you are the violinist, you are the trumpeter, you are all of these things. And in the end, if all of that works, you end up becoming Tchaikovsky or Beethoven or any one of a number of geniuses from the world of classical thought. And so I wouldn't dissuade anyone from, learning that. All those things that I've not learned that I have to look up if I want to do it. The compass of the instruments. How high does a trumpet go? There are different types of trumpets. And there's all this information that some people contain in their head and can write a score on the back of an envelope in 5 seconds. And just such a person might be John Barry, for instance. Someone who's terribly, terribly quick, or was, and George Martin, who apparently could write you a string score on the back of an envelope. Oh, you'd like, okay, yes, here you are. It's like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Peter Cook could write comedy. How long do you want the sketch? Oh, 30 minutes? Okay. Yeah, you put down the phone. 30 minutes later, he phones you up and says, yes, it's done. I'll send it to you. Such geniuses that are the movers and shakers of our time make mere mortals like myself jealous. I know that it takes me time. I'm not quick. I make a lot of mistakes. I screw up, especially when I'm playing at home. If you see something that seems to be a perfect concert, it's not because I don't ever make any mistakes. Let's forget that one. It's by making mistakes that you grow,
Of course,
stretch yourself and the instrument and your writing. Yeah, you've got to jump in with both feet and be a jackass.
love it, love it. Now we've been going here for a while, and I appreciate your time. But before we end, I need to ask you this next question.
Sure thing.
Go on for as much as you like, or as little as you like. But music and your personal relationships, how has music touched your personal relationships? You've been married a few times. You have a great relationship with Joe.
Yes.
I think you just had an anniversary not too long ago, right?
We did, quite right. Yes.
How hard has music been in your personal relationships, or easy? I mean, how has that affected you? And can you talk to that a little bit, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. Well, I'm lucky to be married to Joe, who it's music that brought us together.
Yeah.
She was making a film, and she wanted some music, and I was newly signed to Zomba, who were doing music for film, and that was very interesting. So my wife, Jo, also loves to travel. She was a world traveler before we'd met. And so subsequently, we've been able to, I've been able to take her everywhere on the touring map that a musician gets to go to. I've traveled a lot of countries, played in a lot of countries. And she'd take me to, the outer reaches of places where I've yet to play and probably will never play. Places such as India, China, Borneo, and all the rest. So music has been very good to us. She's very patient. She also comes from a line of musicians. Her father played violin and her grandfather played violin, and she played as a girl. And she realized that she wouldn't have a professional future at doing that. But she said she could still dream up melodies and know where melodies should go. So if I'm stuck for something, I'll ask her and she'll immediately come up with something, or come up with an immediate variation, and sometimes whole melodies on her own that are very interesting without the harmonies. But then between Roger King and myself, we've managed to take something like this that will work as an a cappella melody and give it harmony, something that Roger happens to be brilliant at doing. So yeah, there are examples of things I would say, yeah, well, this song wouldn't have been there but for her. And sometimes kicking off something lyrically, she'll do that. Usually if she comes up with a lyric, it'll take me 6 months to a year to figure out how to interpret that. I think that Elton and Bernie, between the two of them, it's rather quicker, I suspect. But where he seems to instantly know, because obviously that's part of Elton John's brilliance and Bernie Taupin's brilliance, of course. So that partnership, I think, is very important. That's what I'm saying. It can divide couples. It can bring couples together and make them stronger. I think you have to have the right partner. If your partner is saying to you, I want you to give up music and become an accountant and a lawyer or a doctor or something, if that's what you're prepared to do, then fine. But if music is the oxygen that you breathe, it's going to shorten your life. So you've got to fight for the things that you believe in and actually make yourself popular. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Make yourself unpopular in order to be popular. In other words, unpopular in the short term, but popular in the long term. You know, to put people on the "I told you so" list. It's not always easy when you've got a vision of something, sticking to your guns, metaphorically, not literally. I think we're lucky to have a passion for something. It points the way.
Well, thank you. I mean, I love this. This is great. I loved having these kinds of conversations because everybody answers these questions a little bit differently, and your
Sure.
stories are unique to you. And I think it's going to be a great way to relay some of this information, especially to a younger player who looks up to guys such as us and gals who've done this and sort of made it happen. So I really appreciate your honesty and candor in answering these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. It's been great talking to you. And I know that there's a whole other interview where I could be in your position and say to you, when did you first blah, 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 and what do you think now? But thanks for
maybe we'll do that one day.
Thanks for a great interview. Yes, indeed.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. Have a great day.
All the best. Yeah, you too. Cheers.
Cheers.
And there you go. My conversation with Steve Hackett. I loved his honesty, his candor, all the stories he had to tell. It was super fun, and I really appreciate him giving up his time to sit down and talk with me. Thank you, Steve Hackett. Again, if you are watching or listening on YouTube, appreciate it very much. Subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on Podbean, Apple, or Spotify, follow the podcast and join me again in a couple of weeks for the next episode of So You Want to Be a Musician. Cheers, everybody.